So I brought Ryan here today to talk about the merger of traditional threat intelligence with social and digital media. So I guess my first question, Ryan, is especially with the 2016 elections, everyone's rushing onto social media, whether you're at work, whether you're at home, on your phone and things like that. What do you think is the risk of people being so connected to these different platforms, whether they are at work or at home, and why is that turning into a problem for the security team?
I think it's ultimately a huge problem for the security team because it's ultimately off-platform. It typically happens outside of the walls of the enterprise, which traditionally security operations don't have very much visibility or access to. So it gives a vulnerability. It's basically a chink in the armor for the perimeters that a lot of the SOC and certs have kind of built up. And as you kind of mentioned, the volume of people doing the social media is exponentially more than what the enterprise or what the employees are doing inside. So the probability of risk is significantly higher. So it's a huge threat to all organizations and enterprises.
So I guess another question I have is, especially with something like social media and these different websites that, let's just say, do job postings, or a lot of these are like necessary evils for a lot of departments in an organization in order to function. So marketing, for example, they need to engage with their customers and prospects. What kind of tips would you give to somebody, maybe a brand new SOC manager or somebody that's kind of going out there and collecting requirements for their business to work with the marketing department or other departments to kind of build allies to kind of get coverage for this type of threat intelligence requirement?
Bridging the gap between departments is hands down the biggest obstacle of any organization, whether it's politics or bureaucracy. Traditionally it was the security analyst and the network engineers. Tremendously valuable assets to each other, but bridging that gap was very difficult. Now it's expanding to HR, marketing. Traditionally Spearfish was a big issue, and HR, it's your job to open up resumes. So the adversary could easily put some payload or malware into a PDF, and it's literally your job to open it up. Mm-hmm. The same thing goes with marketing firms, their marketing departments. It's their responsibility to be on top of these things, so they have to engage with the outside communities and people, which makes it much easier for the adversary to build that rapport with a little bit of benign communication, and then ultimately, at that point, send something a little bit more malicious, knowing that the probability of risk for them clicking it is much higher.
How do you think something like social and digital, like outside the firewall, how does that play into traditional threat intelligence? And are there any lessons learned in a lot of the places that you've worked that we can use to help protect people more on these platforms?
I think threat intelligence is such an ambiguous, confusing definition. Back in my operational days, you'd ask the security analyst, what are you worried about? He was adamant about it's got to be within the four walls for me to really worry about it. Whereas the traditional threat intelligence is, I'm worried about the people outside and what they're doing. I want to see visibility somewhat inside, but more so externally so I can get ahead of the threat. And that's ultimately the biggest issue, is bridging that gap between the traditional and the more modern intelligence tradecraft. And social plays right into that. It's a relatively newer technology from some of the older things. So you get ultimately guys that have been doing this for 20 or 30 years, old habits die hard. How do you ultimately get them visibility and insights into the social media from an analyst standpoint, from an organizational standpoint?